Last week, we looked at 20 different bushcraft tips for heavy rain scenarios. To build on that episode, this week we're going to look at a few simple shelters that you can set up during strong winds. Having spent a large amount of time setting up shelters during less than ideal conditions, and having shelters fail on me on a number of occasions, I've managed to streamline my setups so that I can make a shelter in a matter of minutes. To start with, I have a few fundamental tips that I always stick by and have done for a few years now. I am fully aware that some tarps have more tie-up points than others, but the majority of tarps will generally have at least 4 tie-up points. The first tip is that I make sure to always have guy lines tied out on at least 4 corners of my tarp. These will stay on my tarp all year round. Most of my shelter setups can be made with just these 4 tie-out points, but sometimes I need to add 1 or 2 extra guy lines. The tarp I use is a square tarp, normally 3 by 3 meters, but with this ultralight one, it's actually 2.9 by 3 meters, so near enough a square shape. Before I show you the shelters, it's worth mentioning that I now tend to keep my tarp stuffed in the side pocket of my backpack instead of a separate dry bag. That way I can quickly deploy the tarp in strong winds, as the backpack keeps the tarp from flapping around when trying to peg it out or hang it from a tree. I normally tie the last tie-up point to the zip of my bag so that it never blows away. To make it easier for you guys to see, I'm going to set the first shelter up by laying it out in a square. I normally have about 2.5 to 3 meters of cordage on my guy lines. On this particular tarp, I have used bank line, but I also use 550 paracord. If you want to set up your tarp in the quickest way possible, then it's better to bring some strong metal tent stakes with you. However, to save on weight and space in the pack, I tend to make my own, unless I am heading to an area of open land where there are very few trees. I look for thin sticks that have a number of broken branches and knots coming off them. This particular woodland is dense, with Scots pine being the predominant species. As it's dense, the trees are growing close together, and as a result, they grow really straight. This makes it ideal for quickly whittling up some stakes. Snap or saw the branches just above the knots. This small stick produced 7 stakes. These protruding branches act as a hook to stop your guy lines from falling off the stakes when you peg them out. Using a knife, I then put some points onto the ends of the stakes. For the first shelter, peg out the 4 corners of the tarp. Once all corners are pegged out, it pins the tarp to the ground and the wind shouldn't pull it up. From there, I then peg out the 2 tie-up points that are right next to the corner tie-ups. As each peg goes in, I pull the tarp diagonally so that there is tension between each peg. I do this to the 2 far corners of the tarp. This is going to be the back of the shelter, so ideally have the back facing the wind. That way the wind will blow up and over the shelter and not directly inside it where you are likely to be sleeping. I unpeg the 2 back corners of the tarp and tuck them underneath. The eagle-eyed among you might notice that I also have a guy line tied to the centre tie-up point of the tarp. This gets used in a different shelter which I will show you later on in the video. Now I come to the front of the tarp. I take the corner that was staked out and unpeg it. I find the next tie-up point along from it and add about 6 inches, then I flip the corner tie-up point to here and peg it in. I do the exact same thing to the other side. Find the next tie-up point from the corner, add a few inches, and then flip the corner in and peg it out. This will be the front of the shelter. Next up, I cut a branch about the thickness of my wrist. I use my bushcraft knife to bevel one end of the stick. This end is going to push up against the tarp, so it's best to make the end as smooth as possible. I leave the other end flat. Then I take my stick and place it underneath the centre of the tarp, making sure it is as straight as possible. This is where the beveled end of the stick needs to be facing the tarp material. You can add a shamag or a spare sock to the tip of the stick to stop it from piercing the tarp if you wish, but I've never had a problem by just beveling it. Now you don't have to do this next step, but I find it does help to make the tarp have more tension. Take a piece of cordage and tie to the next tie-up point from the front centre tie-out. Fold this piece of loose tarp back on itself and tie it off at the back corner peg. I use an adjustable guy line hitch to do this, which you can see in more detail in my tarp setup video in the description box below. Do exactly the same to the opposite side. Finally, you can add a guy line to the front centre of the tarp to tie out the entrance and help shed the rain away from the entrance of your shelter. Now you have a low profile tarp tent. which I find works well in strong winds as it has a number of angles to it. I find it tends to deflect the wind away from the shelter rather than act like a sail and catch the wind. The entrance at the front is tight, but it leaves a big enough gap for airflow, yet small enough that you're well sheltered from strong winds than you would be with an open tarp. There is a surprising amount of space inside the shelter. The great thing about this is that if you are camping in open ground, and you prefer to carry a tarp in your kit as opposed to a tent, you can use an adjustable hiking pole to maintain the tension of the tent and set it to the height that you prefer. The lower the roof, the wider the space inside. The higher the roof, the narrower the space inside. Some people might be asking, why not just take a tent for a shelter instead of a tarp? Well, the answer is personal preference. A tarp is far smaller when packed down. You don't need any tent poles, which might fail on you, and you can make a vast array of different shelters from just one tarp. Whereas a tent, you are stuck with the same footprint regardless. Both have their place. The next shelter is for hammock campers. You only need to use the 4 tie-up points at the corners of the square tarp. First, find 2 trees that are just a bit wider than the width of your tarp. Tie one corner of the tarp to the tree. Now, there are a number of knots that you can use to tie a tarp to a tree. I tend to use a Siberian hitch. If you want to learn how to tie it, I recommend watching my tarp setup video in the description box below. Once you have tied the knot, grab the other corner of the tarp and tie this off to the opposite tree. Note that I am tying opposite ends of my tarp so that it is set up in a diagonal pattern. Once your tarp is secured in between the trees, you should have just 2 guy lines remaining. Grab these and peg the tarp out so that it is tight. Again, I use an adjustable guy line hitch so that I can adjust the tension of the tarp if the wind and rain make the tarp sag over time. Then head on over to the opposite side and do the same there. If the winds are strong, then don't use too much guy line. Just peg the tarp down as low as possible so that you are well sheltered from the wind. And that's it. With the 2 guy lines pegged out, you set up a diamond fly tarp. All you need to do now is string your hammock in between the trees. The great thing about this setup is not only is it great in strong winds, but you can also adapt it to make it much more spacious when the weather has calmed down. All you need to do is undo one of the side guy lines, and this time take it further out to the side and tie it to a tree about head height. The other side should be the one that is protecting you from the wind. Meanwhile, you now have an open view of the forest, as well as the opportunity to have a fire underneath the tarp, providing that you have strung it high enough so that the sparks won't burn holes in it. If the storm has passed and there is little to no wind, then you can unpeg the other side and open it up to have a much wider area protected from above, and it allows you to have a 360-degree view of the surrounding woodland. Should the wind pick up again, you can just take the guy lines and tie them down as close as possible to the centre of the shelter to give you that added protection from the sides again. You'll notice that with this shelter setup, I don't have a specific ridgeline running through the loops in my tarp with prusik loops. This is because all I generally need is 4 guy lines on each corner of a tarp, and I have far more versatility for quicker tarp setups than I would with a pre-tied ridgeline. For example, the tarp tent that I just set up earlier. The final setup, and for me the most simple and effective tarp shelter for camping in strong winds, is the plough point. Now I showed you this in the previous episode, but as a quick recap, all I need to do is pull the tarp out from the side pocket of my pack, tie one corner of it to a tree, then move my backpack away from the tree and peg out the remaining tie-up points. At this stage, I haven't needed to use any guy lines. Finally, I will take the last corner of the tie-up points from the inside of the backpack and peg this out so that the shelter is taut. And that's it. I have an instant shelter that is set up in a matter of minutes. If the wind changes to any direction, then no problem. I just unpeg the tie-up points, rotate the tarp around the tree so that the back of the shelter is facing the wind, and then re-peg it out. No hassle of having to undo guy lines and have the tarp flapping about in the wind. The shelter allows plenty of space inside to sleep and for your gear. And if I want to increase the space inside, I can tie a guy line to the centre tie-up point of the tarp and tie this off to a tree. This gives me a surprising amount of space towards the back of the shelter and allows me to be more protected from the elements. It's important to note that when setting up this shelter in particular, you need to be aware of any dead tree branches above your head. If there are any overhanging dead branches, choose a different tree that is free of the dead branches and more suitable to camp under. And that's it. 3 of my favourite tarp shelter setups for storm camping. Thank you for watching the video, subscribe if you enjoyed it, and if you're interested in this type of thing, then head over to my bushcraft and survival skills playlist on my channel, where there are many more similar videos with tips and skills. For the bushcraft gear I use, head to taoutdoors.com or follow the links in the description below. Oh, and I also have a second YouTube channel called Life of Mike, where I upload all sorts of different videos. If you're interested in following it, I'll put a link below. And finally, my dad runs the sister channel to this one, called TA Fishing, full of great fishing videos for both saltwater and freshwater fishing. All of the links are in the description box below. Cheers for watching, folks, and I'll see you in the next one.